What happens when a man decides to build an empire, not from necessity, but from wounded pride? The question lingers over the flat farmlands of Emilia-Romagna, where the fog settles low in winter and the soil has witnessed centuries of quiet labor. If you find yourself drawn to stories where ambition and downfall intertwine beneath the weight of beautiful machines, consider subscribing. We are building toward our first 1,000, and your presence here makes these investigations possible. This is not merely the story of a car company. It is the story of a man who believed he could challenge a legend, and what that belief ultimately cost him. February 1993. The vineyards of Umbria lay dormant under a pale winter sky. In a modest room at a hospital in Perugia, Ferruccio Lamborghini drew his final breaths. He was 76 years old. Outside, the world knew his name as a symbol of speed, of defiance, of Italian engineering at its most aggressive and sensual. But inside that room, there was only silence. No roaring engines, no flashbulbs, no rivals to defeat. The man who had once declared war on the most famous automotive dynasty in history died far from the factory he had built, far from the machines that bore his name, and long estranged from the company he had created. The official cause of death was heart failure. But those who had watched his journey understood that something else had been failing for decades, something that began the moment pride transformed from fuel into fire. To understand what happened in that hospital room, one must travel back through time and geography, to a small commune in the province of Bologna, where the roads are narrow and the fields stretch toward the horizon in disciplined rows. Sant'Agata Bolognese. Population in the early 1960s, barely 6,000. A place of tractors and wheat, of farmers who rose before dawn and mechanics who understood engines the way others understood prayer. It was here, in this unlikely setting, that Ferruccio Lamborghini chose to plant his flag, not in Milan, where fashion and finance converged, not in Turin, where Fiat had established industrial dominance, but here, in the agricultural heartland, surrounded by the same earth from which he had risen. The factory emerged from the flatness like a declaration, modern, angular, designed not merely for function, but for statement. By 1963, the buildings were operational, and the first prototype, the 350 GTV, had been unveiled at the Turin Motor Show. The press was skeptical. The automotive establishment was dismissive. Who was this tractor manufacturer to challenge the titans of Italian sports cars? Who was Ferruccio Lamborghini to believe he could build something worthy of comparison to Ferrari, to Maserati, to the hallowed names that had dominated racing and luxury for generations? But Ferruccio had an answer. He had money, substantial money, earned through years of manufacturing tractors, heating systems, and air conditioning units. He had technical vision, an instinct for engineering that bordered on obsession. And he had something else, something that would prove both his greatest asset and his most dangerous liability. He had been insulted. The story has been told many times, embellished in some versions, disputed in others. What remains consistent is the essence. Ferruccio Lamborghini, successful industrialist and owner of multiple Ferrari automobiles, had grown frustrated with the quality of the clutches in his cars. He took his complaint directly to Enzo Ferrari, and Enzo, according to most accounts, dismissed him with contempt. Who was a tractor builder to lecture the master of Maranello on automotive excellence? The sting of that dismissal never faded. It calcified into purpose. Within months, Ferruccio had assembled a team of engineers, some of them poached directly from Ferrari itself, and begun designing what he believed would be the perfect grand touring car. Not a racing machine, not a temperamental beast that required constant attention. A refined, powerful, comfortable automobile that would humiliate the competition through sheer superiority of experience. The factory in Sant'Agata Bolognese was the physical manifestation of this ambition. Every brick laid was a rebuttal. every machine installed was an argument. But empires built on vengeance carry a particular kind of weight. The same intensity that drives creation can devour the creator. And as the first Lamborghinis rolled off the production line, gleaming and ferocious and impossibly beautiful, no one yet understood the price that would eventually come due. The fog settled over Sant'Agata Bolognese that winter, as it always did. Inside the factory, the work continued. Outside, the world watched and waited. And Ferruccio Lamborghini, standing at the threshold of his dreams, could not yet see the shadows gathering at the edges of his vision. Ferruccio Lamborghini was not born into wealth. This fact matters more than most biographical details because it explains the particular texture of his ambition, the hunger that never fully subsided, even after the money came. He entered the world on April 28, 1916, in a small village called Renazzo di Cento, roughly 30 kilometers from Bologna. His parents were grape farmers. The land was modest. The work was endless. From childhood, Ferruccio understood that survival required transformation, turning raw materials into something of greater value, turning labor into leverage. But while his family tended vines, the young Ferruccio found himself drawn to machines. He would later recall spending hours disassembling and reassembling anything mechanical he could find, developing an intuition for how components fit together, how force translated into motion, how efficiency could be extracted from chaos. The Second World War interrupted his trajectory, as it interrupted everything in Europe. Ferruccio served in the Italian Air Force, stationed on the island of Rhodes, where he was responsible for maintaining military vehicles under conditions of scarcity and improvisation. Parts were unavailable. Resources were limited. Survival depended on ingenuity. It was here, in the crucible of wartime necessity, that Ferruccio refined his ability to solve problems with whatever materials existed. He learned to see possibility where others saw only limitation. When the war ended and he returned to Emilia-Romagna, he carried this knowledge like a weapon. Post-war Italy was a landscape of rubble and opportunity. The agricultural sector desperately needed machinery, but factories had been destroyed and supply chains shattered. Ferruccio recognized the gap between demand and availability. Using discarded military equipment, trucks, engines, mechanical components abandoned by retreating armies, he began constructing tractors. The work was unglamorous, but essential. Farmers needed machines to rebuild their livelihoods, and Ferruccio provided them. By 1948, he had formally established Lamborghini Trattori, and the enterprise grew with remarkable speed. Within a decade, his company had become one of the largest agricultural equipment manufacturers in Italy. The boy from the grape farm now employed hundreds of workers and commanded a fortune that would have seemed impossible to his parents. But tractors were never the destination. They were the vehicle. Ferruccio accumulated wealth with the discipline of someone who remembered poverty, yet he spent with the appetite of someone determined to prove his arrival. He purchased a helicopter. He bought land. He acquired sports cars, not one, but several, including multiple Ferraris. He wanted the finest machines in the world, and for a time he believed he owned them. Then came the clutch problems. Then came the confrontation with Enzo. Then came the transformation of insult into industry. The factory in Sant'Agata Bolognese represented an investment of approximately 400 million lire, a staggering sum for the early 1960s. But numbers alone cannot convey the audacity of the undertaking. Ferruccio was not merely building a manufacturing facility. He was constructing a challenge to the established order of Italian automotive aristocracy. He hired Giotto Bizzarini, a brilliant engineer who had recently departed from Ferrari under acrimonious circumstances. He recruited Gianpaolo Dallara, young and technically gifted, whose understanding of chassis dynamics would prove revolutionary. He brought in Paolo Stanzani, methodical and precise, to oversee the development process. These men did not join Lamborghini for money alone, though Ferruccio paid well. They joined because they believed in the possibility of creating something new, something uncompromised by the politics and traditions that constrained their former employers. The first true production model, the 350 GT, reached customers in 1964. Its engine, a V12 designed by Bizzarini, refined by Dallara and Stanzani, produced approximately 270 horsepower. The body, shaped by the coach builder Touring of Milan, achieved an elegance that balanced aggression with sophistication. Critics who had expected failure were forced to acknowledge achievement. Orders arrived, production expanded. Within the factory walls, a culture emerged that prized technical excellence above commercial expedience. Ferruccio insisted that his cars would not race. Racing, he argued, was a distraction, an expensive spectacle that diverted resources from the pursuit of perfection in road cars. This philosophy distinguished Lamborghini from Ferrari fundamentally. Enzo Ferrari built cars to win races. Customer vehicles were merely the means to fund his obsession. Ferruccio Lamborghini built cars for the road, for the experience of driving, for the customer who demanded refinement without compromise. The distinction seemed principled. It was also personal. By refusing to race, Ferruccio avoided direct competition with Ferrari on the track, a competition he might have lost. By focusing on grand touring excellence, he defined a battlefield where his advantages could prevail. Pride, once again, shaped strategy. By 1966, the factory had doubled its workforce. The Miura, a mid-engine masterpiece that would redefine the very concept of the supercar, was in development. Magazine covers featured Lamborghinis alongside film stars and industrialists. The name had transcended its origins. Ferruccio Lamborghini was no longer a tractor manufacturer who built cars. He was an automotive visionary whose tractors happened to fund his true calling. Yet even in these years of ascent, fractures were forming beneath the surface. The same independence that allowed Ferruccio to defy convention also isolated him from alliances that might have provided stability. The same perfectionism that demanded excellence from his engineers also created tension and turnover. And the Italian economy, which had fueled the boom of the early 1960s, was beginning to show signs of strain that few wished to acknowledge. What happens when an empire is born from pride, and pride begins to exact its price? The answer was not yet visible in the gleaming bodies of the 350 GT, nor in the revolutionary silhouette of the Miura prototype. But it was coming, and the fog over Sant'Agata Bolognese would not lift forever. The Miura changed everything. To understand its impact, one must first understand what existed before it. In 1965, the sports car world operated according to established conventions. Engines sat in the front. Bodies stretched long and low over mechanical components, arranged in traditional sequence. Beauty was achieved through proportion and craftsmanship, but the fundamental architecture had remained largely unchanged for decades. Then Gianpaolo Dallara, barely 30 years old, proposed something radical. What if the engine were placed behind the driver, mounted transversely, integrated with the transmission in a single compact unit? The configuration had been explored in racing, but never in a road car intended for production. The engineering challenges were immense. The packaging constraints seemed insurmountable. Ferruccio listened to the proposal and gave his approval. The project proceeded in near secrecy. Dallara worked alongside Paolo Stanzani and a young New Zealander named Bob Wallace, who had arrived at the factory as a test driver and mechanic and quickly proven himself indispensable. Wallace possessed an unusual combination of talents. He could drive at the limit of a car's capabilities, then return to the workshop and articulate precisely what needed improvement. His hands were perpetually stained with oil. His observations were perpetually valuable. Together, This trio developed the chassis and mechanical systems, while Ferruccio negotiated with Bertone for the body design. Marcello Gandini, only 27 years old, and recently appointed chief designer at Bertone, received the commission. What he created would become one of the most celebrated shapes in automotive history. The Miura debuted as a bare chassis at the 1965 Turin Motor Show. Even without bodywork, the configuration generated astonishment. When the complete car appeared at Geneva in March 1966, the reaction approached hysteria. The proportions were impossibly low and wide. The headlights hid beneath delicate eyelids. The rear louvers suggested the breathing apparatus of some exotic predator. Journalists exhausted their vocabulary, attempting to describe it. Orders accumulated faster than the factory could process them. The price, approximately 7 million lire, placed the Miura among the most expensive automobiles available, yet demand consistently exceeded supply. Production of the Miura required an expansion of capabilities that tested the young company's resources. Each body was handcrafted at Bertone's facility in Turin, then transported to Sant'Agata Bolognese for assembly. The V12 engine, producing 350 horsepower in initial specifications, demanded precision machining that pushed the factory's equipment to its limits. Quality control became an obsession. Ferruccio personally inspected finished vehicles, running his fingers along panel gaps, listening for imperfections in engine tone, rejecting any car that failed to meet his standards. Workers recall him arriving unannounced on the production floor, asking questions, observing processes, occasionally demonstrating techniques he had learned decades earlier in the workshops of his youth. The factory itself had developed a particular atmosphere by the late 1960s. Unlike the larger Italian manufacturers, where bureaucracy and hierarchy governed every interaction, Lamborghini operated with an intimacy that reflected its founder's personality. Engineers ate lunch alongside assembly workers. Problems were discussed openly, solutions implemented rapidly. The scale remained human, fewer than 300 employees at peak production, and this humanity infused the cars themselves. Each Miura carried the fingerprints, literally and figuratively, of the individuals who built it. Customers sensed this craftsmanship. They were not purchasing a product manufactured by anonymous processes. They were acquiring something closer to art. Yet the economics of this approach contained inherent tensions. Handcrafted excellence demanded time, and time translated into cost. The profit margins on each vehicle, while substantial in absolute terms, could not absorb significant disruption. Lamborghini lacked the diversified product lines that cushioned larger manufacturers against market fluctuations. The company produced magnificent automobiles, but it produced them slowly, expensively, and without the safety net of mass-market vehicles to subsidize the exotic ones. Ferruccio understood these vulnerabilities intellectually, but his pride prevented the compromises that might have addressed them. He refused to dilute the brand with lesser products. He refused to seek partnerships that might have provided capital cushions. He refused, most fundamentally, to cede any control over the enterprise he had built from wounded dignity. By 1968, Lamborghini had established itself as a legitimate force in the automotive world. The Miura had been joined by the Espada, a four-seat Grand Tourer that demonstrated the company's range. The Islero offered a more refined alternative for customers seeking discretion over spectacle. Magazine covers continued to feature Lamborghini designs. Celebrity owners proliferated. The factory in Sant'Agata Bolognese hummed with activity and purpose, a monument to what one man's determination could achieve. But 1968 was also a year of upheaval across Italy. Student protests erupted in universities. Labor unions organized with increasing militancy. The economic miracle that had transformed the country since the war was generating social pressures that demanded release. In the industrial north, workers began demanding not merely higher wages, but fundamental changes in workplace conditions and power structures. The tremors had not yet reached Sant'Agata Bolognese with full force, but they were coming. And Ferruccio Lamborghini, who had built his empire on personal authority and individual vision, was singularly unprepared for what collective action would demand. The autumn of 1968 arrived with a tension that seemed to permeate the very air of northern Italy. In Milan and Turin, factory workers staged strikes that paralyzed production lines. In Bologna, students occupied university buildings and clashed with police in the ancient streets. The period would later be called the Hot Autumn, though its heat was not meteorological but social, the accumulated pressure of a generation demanding change. At the Lamborghini factory in Sant'Agata Bolognese, the rhythm of work continued, but even here, in this enclave of precision and purpose, the outside world could not be entirely excluded. Ferruccio observed the unrest with a mixture of incomprehension and irritation. He had risen from poverty through labor. He had built his fortune by working harder and thinking more clearly than his competitors. The concept of collective bargaining struck him as fundamentally alien, a surrender of individual agency to the mediocrity of the group. He paid his workers well, better than many comparable factories. He maintained conditions that prioritized safety and dignity. What more could be demanded? The answer, he would discover, was not material, but philosophical. The workers wanted voice. They wanted participation in decisions that affected their lives. They wanted, in essence, a share of the pride that Ferruccio had always reserved for himself. The strikes came to Sant'Agata Bolognese in 1969. Production slowed. Negotiations consumed hours that might have been devoted to engineering. Ferruccio found himself in conference rooms rather than on the factory floor, arguing over provisions that seemed to him distractions from the essential work of building automobiles. The experience embittered him. He had created something magnificent, provided employment to hundreds, elevated the reputation of Italian craftsmanship on the world stage. And now he was being treated as an adversary by the very people whose livelihoods depended on his vision. The irony was not lost on him, neither was the wound. Meanwhile, the cars themselves continued to astonish. The Miura had evolved through successive versions, the P400, the S, and eventually the SV, each iteration refining the original concept toward greater performance and reliability. Bob Wallace, working in a small experimental department, developed a prototype called the Jota that pushed the design to its absolute limits. The Jota was never intended for production. It was an exercise in possibility, a demonstration of what the platform could achieve when freed from the constraints of customer expectations. Wallace drove it on public roads surrounding the factory, testing components, gathering data, occasionally terrifying slower traffic with its raw velocity. The car became legendary among enthusiasts, a ghost that haunted the imagination of collectors for decades. Inside the main factory building, the atmosphere retained its peculiar intensity. The production area occupied approximately 500 square meters, filled with the sounds of pneumatic tools, the smell of lubricants and leather, the constant movement of components toward completion. Each car required roughly 400 hours of assembly labor, nearly 10 weeks of a single worker's full-time effort, concentrated into one vehicle. The number conveys productivity. It does not convey the reality of hands shaping metal, eyes inspecting tolerances, minds solving problems that arose uniquely with each chassis. Visitors to the factory often remarked on the silence between the mechanical noises, the concentration that seemed to fill the spaces where conversation might have occurred. Ferruccio himself had begun to withdraw from daily operations. The labor disputes had drained something essential from his engagement. He spent increasing time at his estate in Umbria, where he had purchased land and begun cultivating vineyards. The agricultural work reconnected him with rhythms he had known in childhood, the patience of seasons, the honesty of soil, the satisfaction of growth that depended on natural processes rather than human negotiations. Wine, unlike automobiles, did not require managing temperamental engineers or placating restless workers. Grapes did not form unions. His absence from Sant'Agata Bolognese created a vacuum that others filled imperfectly. The engineering team continued to innovate, developing new models including the Uraco, intended as a more accessible entry point to the brand. But strategic decisions languished. Investments were delayed. The company that had thrived on Ferruccio's direct involvement began to drift without his constant attention. And then, in 1971, the Miura factory was flooded. A nearby river overflowed its banks, sending water through the production facility and damaging equipment, components, and partially assembled vehicles. The financial impact was severe. Insurance covered some losses, but the disruption to production created cascading problems with suppliers, customers, and cash flow. Ferruccio surveyed the damage with the expression of a man watching something precious slip beyond his grasp. The flood was not his fault. The labor unrest was not his fault. The economic instability spreading across Italy was not his fault. But fault and consequence are different currencies, and the bills were coming due regardless of their origin. What happens when an empire is born from pride, and pride begins to exact its price? The water receded from the factory floor. The machines were repaired. Production resumed. But something had shifted in the foundations, something that could not be restored by pumps and labor. The man who had built Lamborghini from nothing was beginning to contemplate a future in which he might no longer control it. The early 1970s presented a paradox that would define Lamborghini's trajectory. The cars had never been more spectacular. The Countach, unveiled as a prototype at the 1971 Geneva Motor Show, represented a design so radical that visitors questioned whether it could possibly function as a real automobile. Marcello Gandini had outdone even his work on the Miura, creating a shape composed of flat planes and acute angles, doors that swung upward like the wings of some impossible insect, a wedge profile that seemed to slice through the air even while standing still. The name itself, Countach, was Piedmontese dialect, an exclamation of astonishment that workers allegedly uttered upon first seeing the design. Whether the story was true mattered less than its aptness. Astonishment was the only appropriate response. Yet behind this triumph of form, the company's foundations were eroding with accelerating speed. The oil crisis of 1973 struck the automotive industry like a hammer blow. Petroleum prices quadrupled within months. Governments imposed speed limits. Fuel economy became a sudden priority for consumers who had previously cared only for performance. The market for exotic sports cars, vehicles that consumed fuel with the enthusiasm of small aircraft, contracted severely. Orders declined. Deposits were cancelled. The economics that had always been precarious became genuinely threatening. Ferruccio watched these developments from an increasing distance. His vineyard in Umbria had become more than a retreat. It had become an alternative identity, a life that did not require defending against forces beyond his control. He was 57 years old. He had spent 2 decades building enterprises, managing crises, absorbing the stress of responsibility for hundreds of employees and their families. The automobile company that bore his name had brought him fame, but also exhaustion. The pride that had fueled its creation now felt like a burden too heavy to continue carrying. In 1972, he had sold a significant portion of his shares to Georges-Henri Rossetti, a Swiss businessman. The transaction provided capital that the company desperately needed while reducing Ferruccio's personal exposure to its mounting difficulties. But it also marked the beginning of a separation that would prove irreversible. Ferruccio remained involved, attending meetings, offering opinions, occasionally visiting the factory floor, yet his authority had become advisory rather than absolute. Decisions that once required only his approval now involved negotiations with partners whose priorities did not always align with his vision. The factory continued to operate under this divided leadership. The Countach entered production in 1974, its development having consumed years of engineering effort and substantial financial resources. The production version differed from the prototype in numerous details, the pure concept compromised by practical necessities, but it remained extraordinary by any conventional standard. Its V12 engine, mounted longitudinally behind the driver, produced 375 horsepower. Its top speed exceeded 290 kilometers per hour. Its price placed it among the most expensive automobiles in the world, accessible only to the wealthiest enthusiasts and collectors. But wealth in 1974 was being redefined. The economic turbulence that had begun with the oil crisis was spreading into inflation, recession, and social instability across Western economies. Italy suffered particularly. The lira weakened, interest rates climbed. Businesses that depended on discretionary spending found their customer bases shrinking. Lamborghini, producing perhaps 400 cars annually at peak capacity, could not absorb these shocks through volume. Each unsold vehicle represented not merely lost revenue, but accumulated cost. Materials purchased, labor expended, capital immobilized in gleaming machines that waited in factory storage for buyers who might never arrive. Ferruccio sold his remaining shares in 1974. The buyer was a friend, René Leimer, another Swiss entrepreneur who believed the company could be stabilized with proper management. Ferruccio accepted the payment, reported at approximately 600 million lire, and withdrew entirely from the enterprise he had founded 11 years earlier. He did not attend a farewell ceremony. He did not deliver a valedictory address to the workers who had built his cars. He simply departed, leaving behind the factory, the name, the raging bull emblem that had become synonymous with Italian automotive excellence. The departure was quiet, almost invisible to the outside world. Magazines continued to feature Lamborghinis. Celebrities continued to pose beside them. The brand's image remained untarnished by the financial difficulties concealed within the factory walls. But inside Sant'Agata Bolognese, those who had worked alongside Ferruccio understood that something fundamental had ended. The company would continue. The cars would continue. The name would endure long beyond any individual's lifespan. Yet the animating spirit, the wounded pride transformed into mechanical poetry, had withdrawn to tend grapes in the Umbrian hills. What happens when an empire is born from pride, and the proud man walks away? The question echoed through the empty office that had once been Ferruccio's, through the production lines where workers continued their meticulous labor, through the years that would follow under owners who understood business, but perhaps not beauty. The answer was still unfolding, and it would prove more complicated than anyone anticipated. The years following Ferruccio's departure revealed just how fragile the enterprise had always been. René Leimer's stewardship lasted barely 2 years before financial pressures forced another transfer of ownership. The company passed to a consortium of creditors, then to the Mimran brothers, Patrick and Jean-Claude, whose family fortune derived from sugar trading in West Africa. Each transition brought new promises of stability, new capital infusions, new management philosophies. Each transition also brought disruption, uncertainty, and the gradual erosion of institutional knowledge that accumulates only through continuity. The factory in Sant'Agata Bolognese became a stage for this recurring drama of hope and disappointment. Workers who had joined during the Miura years watched as unfamiliar executives arrived with unfamiliar plans, implemented changes, then departed when those plans proved insufficient. The machinery remained. The skills remained. The name on the building remained. But the sense of unified purpose that Ferruccio had imposed through sheer force of personality could not be replicated by corporate structures or financial engineering. Production continued, though at volumes that would have seemed modest even by the company's historically small standards. The Countach evolved through successive versions: the LP400, the LP400S, the LP500S, each iteration adding power, refining details, responding to customer feedback and regulatory requirements. The car became an icon of 1980s excess, appearing on bedroom posters alongside images of wealth and aspiration that defined the decade's fantasies. Yet the irony persisted. The company that built these symbols of success was itself perpetually struggling to survive. By 1978, Lamborghini had entered receivership. The Italian government appointed administrators to oversee operations while potential buyers were sought. For nearly 2 years, the factory existed in a state of suspended animation, not quite dead, not fully alive, producing cars under the supervision of bureaucrats who understood balance sheets, but not the particular alchemy of building something beautiful. The workers, reduced to perhaps 150 from earlier peaks, labored under the shadow of possible closure. Each completed vehicle represented an act of faith that there would be a future in which to sell it. The Mimran acquisition in 1980 brought temporary relief. The brothers invested substantially in new model development, including the LM002, a massive off-road vehicle originally designed for military contracts, and early work on what would eventually become the Diablo. The factory received updated equipment. Employment stabilized. For a few years, it seemed possible that Lamborghini might finally achieve the sustainable foundation that had always eluded it. Meanwhile, in Umbria, Ferruccio Lamborghini had constructed an entirely different existence. His estate, called La Fiorita, sprawled across hillsides planted with Sangiovese grapes. He had built a small winery, producing wines that bore his name and his personal attention. The work suited him in ways that automobile manufacturing never fully had. Vines did not demand negotiations. Harvests did not require managing temperamental designers. The rhythm was ancient, predictable, connected to cycles that preceded industry and would outlast it. Visitors who encountered him during these years described a man at peace, weathered by time, but unburdened by the anxieties that had marked his industrial career. He followed news of the company from a distance, through newspapers and occasional conversations with former colleagues. The reports brought mixed emotions: satisfaction when successes were announced, something more complicated when difficulties emerged. He had created Lamborghini. He had also abandoned it. The relationship between creator and creation does not dissolve cleanly, even when legal ownership has been transferred and daily involvement has ceased. Part of him remained in Sant'Agata Bolognese, in the factory halls where his vision had taken physical form, in the engines that still bore design elements traceable to his original specifications. The Mimran era ended in 1987 when Chrysler Corporation, the American automotive giant, acquired Lamborghini for approximately $25 million. The price reflected both the brand's prestige and its precarious financial position, valuable enough to attract a major corporation, troubled enough to sell for a sum that would barely cover a few months of operating losses at larger manufacturers. Chrysler promised resources, distribution networks, engineering expertise. The workers in Sant'Agata Bolognese listened to these promises with the practiced skepticism of people who had heard similar assurances before. Ferruccio, now in his 70s, observed this latest transition with the detachment of someone watching weather patterns over distant mountains. The company was no longer his concern. The factory was no longer his responsibility. The workers were no longer his family. He had grapes to tend, wines to produce, a life measured in seasons rather than production quotas. And yet, when interviewers occasionally sought him out, asking about the cars, the rivalry with Ferrari, the legacy he had built and relinquished, something flickered in his eyes that suggested the separation was never quite complete. The Raging Bull still charged on hoods and steering wheels. The name still commanded reverence among enthusiasts. But the man who had chosen that symbol, who had seen in its defiance a reflection of his own wounded pride, was growing old in the Umbrian hills, far from the flat farmlands where his empire had risen and fractured. The price of pride was still being calculated, and the final accounting had not yet arrived. February 1993. The hospital in Perugia was quiet in the manner of all hospitals at night, a hush punctuated by distant footsteps, mechanical beeps, the soft labor of machines sustaining life. Ferruccio Lamborghini lay in a bed far from Sant'Agata Bolognese, far from the factory that still bore his name, far from the machines that had made him famous. He was 76 years old. His heart, which had driven him through decades of ambition and disappointment, was failing. The man who had challenged Enzo Ferrari, who had built an automotive dynasty from wounded pride, who had walked away when the weight became unbearable, died in the early hours of a winter morning. The cause was cardiac arrest. The deeper causes were more difficult to name. News of his death traveled slowly through the automotive world. Obituaries appeared in Italian newspapers, then in international publications that covered the industry he had helped shape. They recounted the familiar narrative: the tractors, the insult, the revenge, the Miura, the Countach, the eventual withdrawal. They praised his vision and lamented his departure from the company. They noted, with varying degrees of accuracy, the troubles that had followed his exit. What they could not capture was the silence that settled over La Fiorita after the funeral, the vineyard rose standing bare in winter light, the winery where his wines aged in barrels he would never open. The company continued without him, as it had for nearly 2 decades. Chrysler sold Lamborghini in 1994, just months after Ferruccio's death, to an Indonesian investment group. The Indonesians sold to Volkswagen's Audi division in 1998. Under Audi's ownership, the factory finally achieved the stability that had always eluded it. Production increased, quality improved. New models appeared with regularity. The Murcielago succeeded the Diablo. The Gallardo brought Lamborghini to customers who had previously been excluded by price. The Aventador carried the tradition forward into new decades. Today, the facility in Sant'Agata Bolognese has expanded far beyond its original footprint. Modern buildings house advanced manufacturing processes. Thousands of vehicles emerge annually. The workforce numbers in the hundreds, supported by the vast resources of one of the world's largest automotive conglomerates. Visitors can tour the premises, observing the assembly of machines that cost more than houses, that accelerate faster than thought, that embody engineering excellence refined across 6 decades. Yet something persists in the atmosphere, detectable perhaps only to those who know the history. The original factory buildings still stand, incorporated into the larger complex. The flat farmland still stretches toward the horizon. The fog still settles in winter, softening edges, obscuring distances. And somewhere in this landscape, in the pause between one process and the next, the question lingers, the question that animated Ferruccio's ambition and haunted his retreat. What happens when an empire is born from pride, and pride begins to exact its price? The answer is not singular. It is written in the cars that still bear the Raging Bull, in the vineyards that still produce wine under the Lamborghini name, in the factory that survived its founder's departure and his death, and the endless transitions of ownership. The answer is written in silence, the silence of a hospital room in Perugia, the silence of an empty office in Sant'Agata Bolognese, the silence that falls when engines finally stop. Ferruccio Lamborghini built something that outlasted him. Whether that constitutes victory or defeat depends on definitions he never provided. The cars remain. The name remains. The pride, transformed, transferred, perhaps transcended, remains. The fog lifts slowly over the factory. Inside, the work continues. If this story has moved you, consider leaving a like and subscribing to join us as we explore more histories hidden within extraordinary places. Tell us in the comments which mansion or estate you would like us to investigate next. Thank you for being here, for listening, for remembering alongside us. Some stories deserve to be told slowly. This has been one of them.